A mother and daughter vanish without a trace during what was supposed to be a short trip. 22 years later, a letter arrives at their old home with a chilling message. Dad, I'm alive. What happened to them? Why did they disappear? And why now, after all these years? A heartbreaking mystery unfolds, filled with secrets, betrayals, and revelations that will change everything. Stay until the end to uncover the shocking truth behind this family's most devastating mystery. And before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The wind howled outside as Andrew Carter paced restlessly in the living room of his suburban Chicago home. His wife, Sophia, and their 13-year-old daughter, Julia, had left that morning for a short trip, one that was supposed to last no more than 2 days. The reason for their sudden departure was heartbreaking. Sophia's mother, an elderly woman who had been battling illness for years, had passed away the night before. Since it was the holiday season, and both Sophia and Julia were off from school and work, it only made sense for them to travel to Ohio for the funeral. Andrew had stayed behind due to work obligations, though he now regretted not going with them. That morning, when they had left, everything had seemed perfectly normal. Julia had been in good spirits, despite the somber occasion, and Sophia had kissed Andrew goodbye in the doorway, whispering, "I'll call you when we arrive," but that call never came. Hours passed, and Andrew tried not to panic. Maybe they had stopped for lunch. Maybe the funeral arrangements had taken longer than expected. He told himself 100 different reasons why she hadn't called, but deep down, an unease settled in his chest like a heavy stone. By nightfall, he began calling her phone. No answer. He called again, straight to voicemail. He tried Julia's phone next, his fingers trembling as he tapped the number. It rang twice before also going to voicemail. Something was wrong. He could feel it. At exactly 10:37 p.m., his phone buzzed, and he nearly dropped it in his rush to answer. He didn't recognize the number, but his instincts screamed at him to pick up. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Mr. Carter?" A serious voice on the other end responded. "This is Officer Reynolds from the Ohio State Police. Are you the husband of Sophia Carter?" The room seemed to close in around him. "Yes, I am. What's going on? Where is my wife?" The officer hesitated. "Sir, we found her car abandoned by the side of the highway. The doors were unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, but there was no sign of your wife or daughter." Andrew's breath caught in his throat. He felt his knees weaken as the weight of the officer's words sank in. "What do you mean they're not there?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Did they have an accident? Were they taken to a hospital?" "No, sir," Reynolds said. "There's no sign of an accident. No skid marks, no damage to the vehicle. The strange thing is, all their belongings were inside. Her purse, their luggage, even a book that appears to belong to your daughter. But there's no trace of them anywhere." Andrew clutched the phone tighter. "That doesn't make sense," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand this is distressing," Reynolds said carefully. "We've initiated a search, and I need to ask you a few questions. Is there any reason your wife would have left voluntarily?" The question made his blood run cold. "No," he said firmly. "Absolutely not." But as he spoke the words, a memory from that morning surfaced in his mind. Sophia had seemed distracted, lost in thought. At one point, she had turned to him and said, "There's something I need to tell you when I get back." He had asked her what it was, but she had only given him a small, sad smile. "I'll tell you later." Now she was gone. The officer continued, "There was one unusual thing. We found a receipt from a gas station about 50 miles from here, timestamped at 1:45 p.m. It looks like she filled up the tank, bought some snacks, and there's a security camera. The footage shows Sophia and Julia walking out of the store. Andrew's heart pounded. "Then what happened?" "That's the thing," Reynolds said, his tone grim. A minute later, the camera shows them walking towards their car, and then they go out of frame. They never reappear. The words sent a shiver down Andrew's spine. "What do you mean? They just vanished?" "We're looking into all possibilities, sir," Reynolds said. but Andrew could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I'd advise you to come to Ohio as soon as possible." Andrew barely remembered hanging up the phone. The world around him felt like it was tilting, shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. His wife and daughter were missing, their car abandoned, their belongings untouched, and no one had any answers. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat, his hands trembling as he stuffed his wallet and keys into his pocket. He was going to Ohio. He had to find them. Hours later, as he drove through the empty highway, memories of his family filled his mind. Julia's laughter as she played in the backyard, Sophia's warm touch on his cheek, the sound of their voices in the house. Now, silence surrounded him, and fear clawed at his chest. At dawn, he arrived at the police station where Officer Reynolds was waiting. The officer handed him a small, plastic evidence bag. Inside was Julia's book, the one she had been reading during the trip. "We found this in the back seat," Reynolds said. Andrew took it with shaking hands. It was one of her favorite novels, something she had read over and over. But when he flipped it open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, wedged between the pages, was a torn piece of paper. A note. 3 words, hastily scrawled in pencil. "Don't trust them." The ground beneath him seemed to disappear. His daughter had written this. But who was she warning him about? Reynolds was speaking, but Andrew barely heard him. His mind raced, questions spiraling. Sophia had said there was something she needed to tell him. Had she known something? Had she been hiding something? The officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "We'll do everything we can to find them, Mr. Carter. But I have to be honest with you. This case doesn't make sense. There's no ransom demand, no signs of foul play. It's as if they simply disappeared." Andrew tightened his grip on the book, his knuckles turning white. He refused to accept that. He would find them, no matter what it took. As he stepped outside, a cold gust of wind sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, his instincts prickling. Something wasn't right. Far across the street, a black car was parked. The engine was off, but the silhouette of a figure sat motionless in the driver's seat. Watching, Andrew's pulse quickened. Someone was following him. He turned to head back inside the station, but before he could move, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. With a deep breath, he answered. A woman's voice, soft and urgent, whispered on the other end. "Stop looking, Mr. Carter. You don't want to know the truth." Then the line went dead. Andrew stood frozen on the sidewalk, his phone still pressed against his ear, though the call had ended. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, soft but urgent, almost pleading. "Stop looking. You don't want to know the truth." The words sent a cold wave of dread through him. His heart pounded as he turned his head slowly toward the black car parked across the street. The silhouette inside remained motionless, watching. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a steadying breath. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to move, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he did, something would happen. Something irreversible. The door to the police station creaked open behind him, and Officer Reynolds stepped outside, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" The question snapped Andrew out of his trance, and he turned sharply, gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "That call," Andrew said, his voice low. "Someone just called me. A woman. She told me to stop looking." Reynolds' brows furrowed, and he gestured for Andrew to follow him back inside. "Let's talk." Andrew hesitated, glancing once more at the black car. The silhouette was gone. His stomach churned, but he turned away and followed Reynolds inside. The office was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of coffee and stale paperwork. Reynolds motioned for Andrew to sit while he picked up a pen. "You said a woman called you. Did you recognize the voice?" Andrew shook his head. "No, it was unfamiliar, but she knew my name. She knew about my wife and daughter." His throat tightened as he replayed the words in his mind. "You don't want to know the truth." "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "What truth?" Reynolds leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "Mr. Carter, I've been doing this job for over 20 years, and I can tell you, sometimes when people disappear, the answers aren't what their loved ones expect. Andrew's jaw tightened. If you're suggesting that Sophia left willingly, I'm not suggesting anything, Reynolds interrupted calmly. I'm just saying that, so far, there's no evidence of a crime. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Their belongings were left behind, but they weren't taken by force. Andrew slammed his fist against the desk. You think my wife ran away with my daughter? That she just abandoned everything? His voice trembled with frustration. That's not Sophia. She wouldn't do that. And Julia. His throat constricted, and he forced himself to breathe. Julia left me a note, he finally said, pulling the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and placing it on the desk. 3 words. Don't trust them. Reynolds picked up the note, reading it carefully. His face remained unreadable. And you believe this was meant for you? Who else? Andrew shot back. She was scared. She knew something. Reynolds exhaled, setting the note down. Then let's follow the lead. Andrew blinked. What? You want to find them, Reynolds said. And I want to know what the hell is going on here. So let's start from the beginning. Who could them refer to? Andrew hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. Sophia was... She was acting strange before she left, like she had something on her mind. She told me she had something to tell me when she got back. Reynolds tapped his fingers on the desk. But she never got the chance. Andrew nodded, his chest tightening. No, she never did. Reynolds sighed. Then that's where we start. He pushed himself up from his chair. We're going to retrace their steps, from the moment they left your house to the moment they disappeared. We'll start with the gas station. Andrew's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or terrified. But one thing was certain. He wasn't stopping until he found his family. The drive to the gas station was silent. Reynolds drove while Andrew sat in the passenger seat, his hands clenched into fists. The landscape blurred past them, endless stretches of highway and empty fields. It had been less than 24 hours since Sophia and Julia had vanished, but it felt like a lifetime. When they finally pulled into the small, run-down gas station, Andrew's stomach twisted. The place looked ordinary, just a dusty stop along the highway. But somewhere within this unremarkable setting, his wife and daughter had disappeared. Reynolds parked and stepped out first, approaching the convenience store. Andrew followed, his heart hammering. A tired-looking clerk stood behind the counter, barely glancing up as they entered. Reynolds flashed his badge. We need to see your security footage from yesterday afternoon. The clerk frowned. You guys were already here. Andrew stiffened. What do you mean, already here? A couple of officers came by this morning, the clerk said. Took the footage. Said it was standard procedure. Reynolds' expression darkened. No one from my department was assigned to retrieve that footage. The clerk shrugged. Well, they had badges. Andrew's blood ran cold. Who were they? The clerk scratched his head. Didn't get names. One was a guy, tall, kinda stocky. The other was a woman, real serious looking. They took the whole security drive and left. Andrew turned to Reynolds. Someone's trying to cover this up. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned in. What about the receipt? The clerk reached under the counter and pulled out a small stack of receipts. He flipped through them before pulling one free. Here. This was the one from yesterday at 1:45 p.m. Paid in cash. Andrew's hands trembled as he took the slip of paper. His wife's signature was scrawled at the bottom. She had been here. She had been alive. Was there anyone else with them? Reynolds asked. The clerk hesitated. They weren't alone. Andrew's breath caught. Who was with them? The clerk frowned, as if trying to recall. I don't know. It was weird. There was a man, but I don't think they were together. He was standing near them, but the way they looked at him, it was like they didn't know him, but he knew them. Andrew's mind reeled. What did he look like? The clerk shrugged. Older guy, maybe late 50s. Gray hair, real sharp looking. He wasn't dressed like a traveler, More like a businessman. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Andrew before turning back to the clerk. Did you hear them say anything? The clerk hesitated. Yeah, the girl, your daughter. She looked scared. She grabbed her mom's arm and said, "We need to go. Now." Andrew's body went rigid. His daughter had been terrified. She had known something was wrong. Did they leave after that? The clerk shook his head. That's the weird part. They walked out, and then they just disappeared. Andrew felt the room spin. That was exactly what the security footage had shown. They had walked outside and then nothing. Someone had taken them, and whoever it was, they had erased the evidence. Reynolds straightened. Mr. Carter, I think it's time we had a serious talk about who might have wanted to make your wife and daughter disappear. Andrew's heart pounded. He had no answers, only fear. But one thing was certain. Someone didn't want them to be found. Andrew sat in the passenger seat of Officer Reynolds' cruiser, gripping his hands together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The revelation at the gas station had rattled him to his core. Sophia and Julia had been scared. Julia had told her mother they needed to go, but they never did. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been close enough for Julia to sense danger. And now the security footage was gone, taken by people pretending to be law enforcement. Someone was covering this up. Reynolds drove in silence, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "We need to talk about your wife," he finally said, his voice steady but cautious. Andrew's stomach tightened. "What about her?" Reynolds glanced at him briefly. "Is there any chance she was involved in something you didn't know about?" Andrew's jaw clenched. "You're asking if my wife had secrets?" "I'm asking if there's any reason someone would want her and your daughter to disappear," Reynolds clarified. "Financial trouble? Personal issues? Anything out of the ordinary?" Andrew wanted to dismiss the idea immediately, but then memories surfaced. Small, fleeting moments. Sophia had been distant the past few months. She had started locking her phone, something she had never done before. There were times when she would disappear for hours, saying she had errands to run, but never explaining what they were. And then, of course, there was what she had said before she left. "There's something I need to tell you when I get back." His throat tightened. "She was acting strange before she left," he admitted. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now," he exhaled sharply, "now I don't know what to think." Reynolds nodded. "We need to go to the last place they were seen. That gas station was the last solid lead. But if someone was following them, there's a chance someone else saw something." Andrew swallowed hard. "Where do we start?" Reynolds pulled onto the highway, heading toward the next town. "We start by finding out who that man at the gas station was." The next few hours were a blur of dead ends. They stopped at every small business near the gas station, showing Sophia and Julia's pictures, asking if anyone had seen them. Most people shook their heads. Some barely glanced at the pictures before saying no. The hopelessness settled into Andrew's chest like a heavy weight. Then, at a roadside diner, they got a lead. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes, studied the picture for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yeah, I saw them." Andrew's breath caught in his throat. "You did." She nodded again. "They came in here yesterday, just for a few minutes." The mom, your wife, looked nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder. "And the girl?" She looked scared. Andrew's pulse quickened. "Did they say anything?" The waitress hesitated, then lowered her voice. The girl kept asking her mom, "Where is he? Where is he?" "And the mom," she said, "He said he'd find us anywhere." The world tilted slightly. Andrew gripped the counter to steady himself. "He?" Reynolds asked, his voice sharp. "Did she say who?" The waitress shook her head. "No, but I remember the way she looked. Like she knew she was running out of time." Andrew felt his chest constrict. "What happened next?" The waitress sighed. "They left. Didn't even order anything. Just walked out real fast." Andrew's hands trembled. They had been running from someone. They had known they were in danger. And now they were gone. Reynolds leaned in. Did you see anyone else watching them? A man, maybe older, gray hair. The waitress frowned, thinking. Actually, yeah, there was a man sitting in the corner. Didn't order anything either, just had a cup of coffee. But when they left, he left too. Andrew felt sick. Do you remember anything else about him? She hesitated. I remember his watch. Reynolds frowned. His watch? She nodded. It was expensive. Not something you see around here. Looked like a Rolex. Andrew's heart pounded. He knew only one person who wore a Rolex like that. Richard Calloway, his father-in-law. The drive back to the station was silent. The air between Andrew and Reynolds thick with tension. Andrew's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling. Richard Calloway, a man who had never approved of his marriage to Sophia. A man who had always made it clear that Andrew was beneath his daughter. But why? Why would he be following them? Reynolds pulled into the station's parking lot, shifting into park before turning to Andrew. Tell me about Richard Calloway. Andrew exhaled shakily. He's wealthy, controlling. He never liked me. He and Sophia had a falling out years ago, and she cut contact with him. He never even met Julia. Reynolds studied him carefully. You think he had something to do with this? Andrew hesitated. I don't know, but if he was at that diner, if he was watching them, his hands clenched into fists. Then I need to find him. Reynolds nodded slowly. Let me handle that. If he's involved, we need to approach this the right way. Andrew wasn't sure what the right way was. His wife and daughter were missing, and now there was a real chance that someone from their past had been the one to take them. That night, back at his hotel, Andrew lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind refused to rest, cycling through possibilities, memories, fears. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He sat up, grabbing it quickly. An unknown number. His hands trembled as he answered. Hello. Silence. Then a voice. Soft. Familiar. Andrew. His breath hitched. Sophia. A pause. Then a whisper. I don't have much time. Please, stop looking for us. Andrew's world shattered. Sophia, where are you? Is Julia safe? A sharp inhale on the other end. I can't. The line crackled. You don't understand. It's not what you think. His grip tightened. Tell me what's happening. The call dropped. Andrew stared at the screen, his heart slamming against his ribs. He tried calling back, but the number was blocked. His wife was alive. She was alive, and she didn't want to be found. Andrew sat motionless on the edge of his hotel bed, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Sophia's voice echoed in his head, each word sending a fresh wave of confusion and devastation through him. I don't have much time. Please, stop looking for us. The way she had said it, it wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. But why? If she and Julia were safe, why wouldn't she tell him where they were? And if they weren't safe, why would she want him to stop looking? None of it made sense. His mind raced, heart hammering so loudly that it drowned out the silence of the room. He tried calling the number again. Blocked. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. Frustration surged through him, and he let out a sharp, ragged breath. He needed answers. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Reynolds' number. It was late, but he didn't care. He hit dial, pressing the phone to his ear as it rang once. Twice. Reynolds picked up almost immediately. Carter. His voice was groggy but instantly alert. She called me, Andrew said, gripping the phone. Sophia. She called me. There was a pause. Then Reynolds' tone sharpened. When? Just now, Andrew said, standing up, his body filled with nervous energy. She told me to stop looking for them. Reynolds cursed under his breath. Did she say where she was? No, just that she didn't have much time. And then the call dropped. The numbers blocked. Reynolds was silent for a moment. She could be in danger. Or... He hesitated. Andrew's pulse pounded. Or what? Or she doesn't want to be found, Reynolds said carefully. Andrew swallowed hard. That doesn't make sense. Reynolds sighed. Look, I've seen cases like this before. Sometimes people leave on their own. And when they do, they'll say whatever they have to in order to keep their past from catching up with them. Andrew shook his head violently. No, this isn't that. She didn't sound like someone who ran away. She sounded scared. Reynolds exhaled slowly. Then we need to figure out what she's afraid of. Andrew clenched his jaw. Richard Calloway. There was a long pause. You really think her father is involved? Andrew ran a hand through his hair. He was at that diner, Reynolds. He was watching them. That can't be a coincidence. Reynolds sighed. Okay, we'll pay him a visit. Andrew's stomach twisted. If Richard Calloway was involved, if he had something to do with Sophia and Julia's disappearance, then Andrew was about to confront a man with far more power and resources than he could ever hope to match. But none of that mattered. He would do whatever it took to bring them home. The Calloway estate was as imposing as ever. A towering mansion on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by acres of meticulously maintained gardens and a wrought iron gate that made it clear. This was not a house for uninvited guests. Reynolds parked in front of the gate, lowering the window to speak into the intercom. Chicago PD, he said firmly. We need to speak with Mr. Calloway. There was a pause. Then static crackled, followed by a smooth, practiced voice. Do you have a warrant? Reynolds' expression didn't waver. Just a few questions. But if you'd prefer we come back with a warrant, we can arrange that. Another pause. Then the gate slowly began to slide open. Andrew clenched his fists as Reynolds pulled forward, the car winding up the long driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade bathed in the soft glow of outdoor lights. Everything about it was cold, calculated, and impersonal, just like the man who owned it. The door opened before they even reached it. A butler, stiff-backed and expressionless, gestured them inside. Mr. Calloway is expecting you. Andrew felt his stomach twist. Expecting them? How? He exchanged a glance with Reynolds, who gave a small nod before stepping inside. The grand foyer was just as Andrew remembered. Marble floors, high ceilings, an air of quiet superiority. And then there he was. Richard Calloway stood at the far end of the room, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, silver hair neatly combed back. He hadn't aged a day. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Andrew, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. Andrew, he said smoothly, as if they were old friends catching up. It's been a long time. Andrew's hands curled into fists. Where are they? Calloway raised an eyebrow. You'll have to be more specific. Andrew took a step forward, barely containing his fury. Don't play games with me. You were at that diner. You were following them. Calloway's smile didn't falter. I have no idea what you're talking about. Reynolds cleared his throat, stepping between them. Mr. Calloway, we have reason to believe you were the last person to see Sophia Carter and Julia Carter before they disappeared. Would you care to explain why you were at that diner? Calloway sighed, as if this were all terribly inconvenient. If you must know, I was in town on business. I stopped at that diner for a coffee. Nothing more. Andrew's blood boiled. You expect me to believe that? Calloway's gaze sharpened. I don't particularly care what you believe. Andrew's breath came fast and heavy. Sophia called me last night. She told me to stop looking for them. Why would she say that? For the first time, something flickered across Calloway's face. It was brief, barely there, but Andrew saw it. A crack in his perfect composure. Reynolds caught it too. You know something. Calloway's expression turned cold again. I know that my daughter made her own choices, and if she doesn't want to be found, perhaps you should respect that. Andrew's chest tightened. What did you do to her? Calloway's smile returned, slow and calculated. Now, making baseless accusations won't bring her back. Andrew lunged, but Reynolds caught his arm, holding him back. That's enough, the officer said. Andrew's pulse pounded. Calloway knew something. He was certain of it, but he wasn't going to say anything. Not yet. Reynolds exhaled sharply, turning back to Calloway. We'll be in touch. Calloway merely smiled. I'm sure you will. Back in the car, Andrew's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. "He knows," he said. "He knows where they are." Reynolds gripped the steering wheel. "Yeah, he does." Andrew turned to him. "So what now?" Reynolds' jaw tightened. "We keep pushing." Andrew nodded, his determination hardening. Calloway wasn't going to talk willingly, but there was something he hadn't counted on. Andrew wasn't going to stop, and no matter what it took, he was going to bring his family home. Andrew sat in the passenger seat of Reynolds' cruiser, his entire body rigid with frustration. The confrontation with Richard Calloway had left him feeling raw, like he had been standing in front of a locked door with the key just out of reach. Calloway had smiled, taunted him, but Andrew had seen it. The flicker of something beneath his perfect, polished exterior. He knew something. He was hiding something. But no matter how much Andrew pushed, Calloway wasn't going to crack that easily. Reynolds exhaled sharply as he pulled out of the long driveway, gripping the wheel a little too tightly. "Well, that went about as well as expected," he muttered. Andrew turned to him, his voice tight. "He's lying." "I know," Reynolds said, his eyes still fixed on the road. "But without any proof, there's nothing we can do." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "We need to find something that forces his hand. He's got too much power, too many connections. We need leverage." Reynolds sighed. "And how do you propose we get that?" Andrew clenched his jaw, staring out the window. Then an idea struck him. His wife. Reynolds frowned. "What?" "Caroline Calloway," Andrew said. "Sophia's mother. She was always in the background, quiet, never speaking up. But she knows things. She has to." Reynolds considered it for a moment, then nodded. "It's worth a shot." Andrew felt the smallest flicker of hope. If Caroline knew something, if she was willing to talk, maybe, just maybe, they could get closer to the truth. Finding Caroline Calloway wasn't as difficult as Andrew had feared. She rarely made public appearances, but according to a quick search, she had been seen recently at a high-end charity gala in the city. That meant she was still in town, still moving within the same circles. But she wasn't at the mansion when they visited, which meant one thing: she had her own place, and Andrew was going to find it. Reynolds managed to track down an address, a luxury penthouse downtown. "This is where she's been staying for the past few years," Reynolds said as they pulled up to the towering glass building. "Looks like she and Calloway have been living separate lives." Andrew stared up at the building, his pulse quickening. If Caroline had distanced herself from her husband, there was a chance she would talk. He just had to get to her before Calloway did. Inside, the lobby was sleek, modern, and painfully quiet. Andrew approached the front desk, heart pounding. "Caroline Calloway," he said. "I need to see her. It's urgent." The receptionist barely looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" Andrew gritted his teeth. "No, but..." Before he could finish, a soft voice cut through the air. "Andrew." He turned sharply. Standing near the elevators was a woman he hadn't seen in over a decade. Caroline Calloway. She was thinner than he remembered, her once dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes lined with something deeper than age: exhaustion, sorrow, regret. She met his gaze with something unreadable, then glanced at Reynolds beside him. "Come with me," she said softly. Andrew followed her into the private elevator, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. She pressed the button for the top floor, the doors sliding shut with a quiet finality. The ride was silent, tense. When the doors opened, Caroline led them into an expansive penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. She walked to a small bar, poured herself a drink, and finally turned to face them. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said quietly. Andrew's stomach clenched. "You knew," she sighed, swirling the glass in her hands. "I knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions." Reynolds stepped forward. "Mrs. Calloway, we need to know what happened to Sophia and Julia." Caroline's grip on her glass tightened. "They're gone," she whispered. "That's all that matters." Andrew's hands curled into fists. "That's not good enough. I know Richard was watching them. I know he was at that diner. And I know you know more than you're letting on." Caroline's expression flickered with something. Fear? Sadness? A mixture of both? She set her drink down, taking a slow, measured breath. Richard is a powerful man, she said. You don't challenge him. You don't question him. She hesitated. And you certainly don't try to leave him. Andrew felt a chill creep down his spine. What are you saying? Caroline met his gaze, her eyes glassy. Sophia tried to leave once before, she said. Years ago, before she met you. But Richard doesn't let go of things he considers his. Andrew's blood ran cold. Are you saying he? Caroline swallowed hard. Let's just say he made it very clear that there are consequences to defying him. Andrew's breath hitched. And now? Caroline hesitated. Then, she whispered, this time, she didn't run fast enough. Andrew's heart nearly stopped. Where are they? Caroline turned away, her arms wrapped around herself. I don't know. Andrew took a shaky step forward. Please, if you know anything. She turned back sharply. You don't understand. If I talk, if I say the wrong thing, he'll know. Reynolds spoke then, his voice even. If you're afraid for your safety, we can protect you. Caroline let out a small, humorless laugh. You don't protect people from Richard Calloway. You survive him. Andrew clenched his jaw. I'm not stopping, he said. I'm going to find them, with or without your help. Caroline studied him for a long moment. Then finally she exhaled. There's one place, she murmured. Andrew's heart pounded. Where? She hesitated again, then walked to a drawer, pulling out a small piece of paper. She handed it to him. An address. Andrew's fingers tightened around it. What is this? Caroline's voice was barely above a whisper. A house Richard owns. One he never talks about. I don't know if they're there, but if he's keeping them somewhere, it would be a place no one knows about. Andrew nodded slowly. Thank you. Caroline's expression softened slightly. Be careful, Andrew. He didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time since this nightmare began, he had a real lead, and he wasn't going to waste it. Back in the car, Reynolds glanced at him. You really think they're there? Andrew stared down at the address, his grip tightening. There's only one way to find out. Reynolds nodded, shifting the car into gear. Then let's go. As they sped through the city, Andrew could feel it. He was close. So close. But as they neared the address, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. Something wasn't right, and he was about to find out why. Andrew sat in the passenger seat, gripping the piece of paper with the address so tightly that it crumpled in his hand. His pulse thundered in his ears as the city lights faded behind them, replaced by empty roads and towering trees. The house Richard Calloway owned, one he never talked about. It had to mean something. It had to be where Sophia and Julia were. Reynolds drove with steady focus, his fingers tapping against the wheel. We approach carefully, he warned. If Calloway really doesn't want people finding this place, we have to assume he's taken precautions. Andrew barely heard him. His mind was a blur of thoughts, fear, and something else, hope. For the first time in days, he had something solid to chase. If they were here, if he could just get to them. The address led them far from the city, winding through roads that grew increasingly remote. They passed through a dense forest, the darkness pressing in around them. No streetlights, no signs of life, just a long, endless road. Then, finally, they saw it. The house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by trees so thick that it was barely visible from the road. It wasn't the kind of house Andrew had expected. It wasn't a mansion or an estate. It was smaller, more unassuming, almost like a retreat, tucked away from the world. But the security was clear. A tall gate stood closed, and as Reynolds slowed the car, Andrew could see cameras perched in the corners, watching. Reynolds exhaled sharply. This place is locked down. Andrew's stomach twisted. That means something's inside worth protecting. Reynolds parked just out of view of the cameras, then turned to Andrew. We don't know what we're walking into. We play this smart. Andrew nodded, though patience was the last thing on his mind. Every second that passed felt like a lifetime. They moved carefully, stepping out of the car and keeping low as they approached the perimeter. The gate was locked, but the security seemed more focused on keeping people out than keeping people in. There was no movement, no guards, just the silent watch of the cameras. Reynolds crouched beside the gate's control panel, studying it. "I can try to override it, but if this alerts someone..." Andrew didn't wait. His body was operating on instinct, desperation overriding caution. He gripped the bars of the gate and began climbing. "Carter," Reynolds hissed, but Andrew was already pulling himself over the top, landing with a quiet thud on the other side. Reynolds cursed under his breath, then followed. They moved quickly, staying close to the shadows as they approached the house. The closer they got, the more unsettling the silence became. No voices, no movement, just the rustling of trees in the wind. Andrew's heart pounded as they reached the back of the house. There was a door, no visible alarm system, just a simple lock. He glanced at Reynolds, who pulled a set of lock-picking tools from his pocket. 30 seconds, Reynolds whispered, working quickly. Andrew pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear any sign of life inside. Nothing. Then, a soft click. The door swung open. Andrew barely hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of wood and something faintly familiar, perfume. Sophia's perfume. His chest tightened. Reynolds moved ahead, sweeping the room with his flashlight. The interior was simple, almost clinical. Kitchen. A living area. Everything looked untouched, as if no one had lived here in years. But then, on the coffee table, something out of place. A single glass of water, half drunk. Someone had been here. Andrew moved toward the stairs, his breath shallow. Every nerve in his body screamed that he was close. He started up, his footsteps careful but quick. He reached the top, the hallway stretching in both directions. Doors lined the walls, all closed. Then a sound. Faint creak. Andrew's head snapped toward the last door on the left. He didn't think. He ran. Reaching the door, he grabbed the handle and turned. Locked. "Julia?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "Sophia." No response. Reynolds reached him, pulling a small crowbar from his belt. "Step back." Andrew barely had time to move before Reynolds jammed the crowbar into the lock, forcing it open with a sharp crack. The door swung inward. Andrew's breath caught. The room was dimly lit, but he saw her immediately. Sophia. She was sitting on the bed, her back to the door, her head bowed. Her hair was longer than he remembered, but it was her. "Sophia," Andrew whispered, stepping inside. She stiffened, her shoulders tensing. Slowly, she turned. And when she looked at him, his heart stopped. Tears filled her eyes. Her lips parted in a silent gasp. "Andrew." Before he could speak, movement behind her caught his eye. And then, Julia stepped into the light. She was taller, older than the last time he had seen her. No longer the little girl he had kissed goodbye that morning all those years ago. She was almost an adult now. Her face was familiar yet different. Her eyes wide with shock, with something he couldn't place. Andrew felt his chest tighten painfully. "Julia." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands trembled at her sides. And then the words that shattered everything. "You shouldn't have come." Andrew froze. Sophia stood, shaking her head. "You have to leave. Now." His mind reeled. "What? No. I came to bring you home." Tears streamed down Sophia's face. "You don't understand. We can't leave." Andrew's stomach twisted. "Why? What's going on?" Julia looked at her mother, then back at him. "Dad, you have no idea what you've walked into." Reynolds stepped forward. "Is someone holding you here? Calloway?" Sophia swallowed hard. "It's not that simple." Andrew's pulse pounded. "Then explain it to me." A deep voice cut through the air. "I'd listen to her if I were you." Andrew turned sharply. A man stood in the doorway. Older, sharp features, dressed in a suit that was just slightly disheveled, as if he had thrown it on in a hurry. Richard Calloway. His gaze was cold, calculating. Andrew's entire body tensed. "You son of a..." "Careful," Calloway said smoothly, stepping into the room. "You're trespassing." Andrew barely heard him. His focus was on Sophia and Julia, on the fear in their eyes. "What did you do to them?" he demanded. Calloway sighed. "I protected them." Andrew's blood boiled. Protected them from what? Calloway's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The truth." Andrew's breath hitched. Sophia's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Please, Richard," she whispered. "Let him go." Calloway tilted his head. "And what about you?" Sophia swallowed. "We made our choice." Andrew's world spun. "What choice?" Calloway's smile widened. "The choice to stay." Andrew felt the ground disappear beneath him. His wife and daughter hadn't been taken. They had chosen not to come back. His chest ached. "Why?" Julia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because we're not safe with you." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Andrew staggered back. And for the first time, he realized he wasn't just here to rescue them. He was here to uncover something he was never supposed to find. Andrew felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His daughter's words echoed in his mind, each syllable a fresh wound. "Because we're not safe with you." His heart pounded against his ribs as he stared at Julia, her face pale, her hands shaking. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Finding them, bringing them home. But never, not once, had he imagined this. That they wouldn't want to leave. That they had been running from him. Sophia stepped forward, her eyes pleading. "Andrew, listen to me." He shook his head, his hands curling into fists. No, this doesn't make sense. You're saying you left on purpose? You just walked away from our life." His voice cracked, raw with disbelief. Sophia's breath hitched. "It wasn't like that." "Then tell me what it was like," he demanded, his voice rising. He turned to Julia, his desperation mounting. "Tell me what's going on, please." Julia swallowed hard, her gaze flickering toward Calloway, who stood in the doorway, watching with a quiet amusement that made Andrew's skin crawl. "You see, Andrew," Calloway said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than a lie." Andrew barely looked at him. His entire focus was on Sophia and Julia. "I don't care about riddles," he snapped. "I care about my family." Calloway chuckled. "And yet, your family doesn't seem to share the sentiment." Andrew's nails dug into his palms. "What did you do to them?" Sophia's lips trembled. "He didn't. I wasn't talking to you," Andrew cut in, his fury aimed at Calloway. "What did you say to them? What did you make them believe?" Calloway sighed, as if this conversation bored him. "I simply helped them see the truth." Andrew's stomach twisted. "And what truth is that?" Calloway's eyes gleamed. "That the man they thought they knew isn't who he appears to be." Silence. The words hung in the air like a knife poised above Andrew's throat. He turned to Sophia, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you believe that?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Andrew, do you?" He pressed, his breath shallow. Sophia hesitated, and in that hesitation, Andrew felt his entire world crack. A sharp, agonizing ache spread through his chest. She wasn't answering. She wasn't denying it. His wife, his best friend. She didn't trust him. Andrew shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "This is insane," he muttered. "I've spent 22 years searching for you. Do you have any idea what that was like? Every single day, waking up not knowing if you were alive or dead, not knowing if someone had hurt you? I never stopped looking, Sophia. And you," his voice caught, "and you just stayed away?" Sophia's tears spilled over, but she didn't move toward him. She didn't reach for him. Julia took a shaky step forward. "Dad." Andrew turned to her, his breath catching. "You," he whispered. "Julia, you were 13. Kid, you needed me." Her lower lip trembled. "I needed the truth." His knees nearly buckled. "And what truth is that?" She hesitated. Then softly, "That you were lying to me my whole life." Andrew's breath left him in a violent exhale. "That's not true." Julia's gaze flickered, pain in her eyes. "Isn't it?" Andrew's chest ached. "Julia, I don't know what he told you, but I swear to you, I never lied to you. I love you. I would have done anything for you. She swallowed hard. Then why did Mom take me away? The question slammed into him like a physical blow. He looked at Sophia, his hands shaking. That's what I want to know. Sophia exhaled shakily, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Because I found something, she whispered. Andrew frowned. What? She hesitated. Then, something about you. Silence. Andrew stared at her, unblinking. That's not possible. Calloway sighed dramatically. Oh, but it is. Andrew turned sharply to him, his patience shattered. What the hell are you talking about? Calloway smirked. Why don't you ask yourself, Andrew? What is it that you don't remember? Andrew's pulse pounded. I remember everything. Calloway sked. Do you? Something shifted in the air. Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accident, Andrew. His breath hitched. What wasn't? Sophia swallowed hard. The day we left. It wasn't just about Mom's funeral. Andrew's heart raced. Then what was it about? Sophia hesitated. Then, the letter. Andrew froze. What letter? Sophia exhaled shakily. The one Julia found the night before we left. His pulse thundered. What are you talking about? Sophia's lips trembled. It was from someone you knew. Andrew's mind spun. Who? Sophia's voice broke. From your first wife. The room spun. Andrew felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. That's not possible. Sophia nodded, her tears falling freely now. She wrote it. She sent it. And Julia found it. Andrew's hands trembled. Sophia, my first wife is dead. Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. No, Andrew. She's not. Silence. A deep, horrifying silence. Andrew shook his head, stepping back. That's impossible. Julia's voice was small, almost childlike. I read it, Dad. Andrew turned to her, his vision blurring. Julia, whatever you read. She was alive, Julia whispered. She said she had to disappear, that she couldn't tell you why. But she was watching. Andrew's head spun. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. His first wife, Emily, had died in an accident. A fire. There had been a funeral. A body. He had mourned. He had moved on. Hadn't he? Calloway smiled darkly. Your past is catching up with you, Andrew. Andrew's breath was ragged. Where is she? Calloway tilted his head. Now that is the real question, isn't it? Andrew's chest ached, his thoughts racing. If Emily had been alive all this time, if she had sent that letter, what had she been trying to warn them about? And if Sophia had read it, why had she run? His stomach twisted. She told you something, didn't she? Sophia swallowed hard. Yes. Andrew's hands shook. What did she say? Sophia hesitated. Then, she said you were never supposed to find out the truth. Andrew's world tilted. The woman he had buried, the past he had let go, it had all been a lie. And now the truth was coming for him. Andrew felt as if the walls of the room were closing in on him, the weight of Sophia's words pressing against his chest like a vice. His breath came shallow, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. She said you were never supposed to find out the truth. He looked at Sophia, at the tears in her eyes, at the way her hands trembled as she clutched herself. He looked at Julia, standing just behind her, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, waiting for him to deny it, to tell them that this was all some horrible misunderstanding. But how could he? His mind reeled. Emily, the woman he had buried, the woman he had mourned, the woman he had lost. She had been alive, and she had sent a letter that had shattered everything. His hands trembled as he took a step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Where is it? Sophia blinked. What? The letter, Andrew said, his jaw tightening. Where is it? Sophia hesitated, her throat working as she swallowed. Then, slowly, she turned and walked to a small dresser against the far wall. She opened the top drawer, reached inside, and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. Andrew's breath hitched as she handed it to him. His fingers shook as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words written in familiar, slanted handwriting. Andrew, if you're reading this, then Julia has found it. And if she has, it means I was right. You were never supposed to know the truth. I never wanted to leave you. I never wanted to disappear. But I had to, because there are things I know that would have destroyed you, that still might. You need to understand, nothing is what you think it is. The life you built, the memories you hold, they're only part of the story. There are people who will do anything to keep the rest buried. People who will hurt anyone who gets too close. I know what happened wasn't your fault, but they won't see it that way. They never have. And if they know you're looking for me, they'll come for you too. You need to let me go. You need to forget. If you love Julia, if you love Sophia, you'll stop searching. This is the last time you'll hear from me. Emily. Andrew's hands shook as he reached the end of the letter, his vision blurring. This couldn't be real. This wasn't real. He had seen Emily's body. He had stood at her grave. Hadn't he? A sick feeling twisted in his gut. What if he hadn't? What if everything, the funeral, the mourning, the closure, had been orchestrated? His breath came fast and shallow. This doesn't make sense. Sophia wiped at her tears. It does, Andrew. You just don't want to believe it. Andrew shook his head. No, Emily died. There was a fire. She disappeared. Sophia corrected, her voice breaking. And someone made you think she died. Andrew's stomach twisted. He turned to Julia, who had gone completely silent. You read this? He asked, his voice hoarse. Julia nodded slowly. I was 13, she whispered. I found it in Mom's bag the night before we left. I didn't understand all of it. But I knew she was telling the truth. Andrew swallowed hard. And you just left? Without telling me? Julia's chin wobbled. You were the mystery, Dad. We didn't know if we could trust you. The words felt like a knife to his chest. Andrew turned away, running a shaking hand through his hair. His mind spun with 1,000 questions, each more overwhelming than the last. How? Why? Who had done this? And if Emily had truly been alive, where was she now? Reynolds, who had been silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Carter, he said, his voice low. If this is true, if someone faked your wife's death, then we're dealing with something a hell of a lot bigger than a missing persons case. Andrew looked up at him, his breath still uneven. Reynolds exhaled sharply. You said there was a body. Andrew nodded. There was. Reynolds' eyes darkened. Then I think it's time we find out whose body it really was. A chill ran down Andrew's spine, because deep down he already knew. The body in that coffin had never been Emily's. An hour later, they were on the road again. The ride was silent, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Sophia and Julia had stayed behind at the house, too shaken to leave. Andrew understood. He barely felt real himself. His hands were clenched into fists as he stared out the window, his mind racing. Emily, alive. All this time, Reynolds spoke, breaking the silence. You need to prepare yourself. Andrew swallowed hard. For what? For the possibility that Emily isn't who you remember, Reynolds said. Andrew turned to him, his stomach tightening. What are you saying? Reynolds sighed. People don't just disappear like that, Carter. Not without a damn good reason. Andrew didn't respond. He couldn't, because Reynolds was right. Emily hadn't just left. She had been erased. And now the truth was clawing its way back to the surface. As they neared their destination, Andrew's pulse quickened. The cemetery, the place where he had said goodbye. But tonight he wasn't here to mourn. He was here to dig up the past. The cemetery was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed in on Andrew's ears, making his own heartbeat sound deafening. The headlights from Reynolds' car cast long shadows over the gravestones, stretching them like ghostly fingers reaching across the ground. The night air was cold, but Andrew barely felt it. He had spent over 2 decades believing a lie. Now, standing before the grave of the woman he had mourned, he was about to uncover the truth. Reynolds shut the engine off and turned to Andrew. Once we do this, there's no going back. Andrew swallowed hard. There was never any going back. Reynolds gave a small nod before stepping out of the car. Andrew followed, his hands clenching at his sides as they walked across the damp grass, moving toward the single headstone that had haunted his memories for years. Emily Carter, beloved wife and mother. 1978 to 2003. Andrew stared at the inscription, his chest tightening. This was supposed to be where she rested. This was supposed to be the place where he had let her go. But if she had never been here, if she had never died, then what had he been grieving all these years? Reynolds exhaled. I made some calls. The coroner's report from 2003 was vague. Fire damage. No DNA analysis. Just a visual confirmation from you. Andrew's stomach twisted. Because I was sure, he whispered. Because I saw her. Reynolds' voice was grim. You saw someone. Andrew's hands clenched. How is that even possible? If it wasn't Emily, then whose body was in that casket? Reynolds shook his head. We're about to find out. Andrew's pulse hammered as he turned toward the figures waiting under the dim glow of a floodlight. The team Reynolds had assembled, a private exhumation crew, hired under quiet circumstances, stood by, their expressions unreadable. The less they knew, the better. One of the men stepped forward. Are you ready? Andrew's throat tightened. Do it. The first shovel hit the dirt. Andrew's breath caught as the process began. He had never imagined himself in a moment like this, watching strangers dig up the grave of a woman he had spent 22 years believing was dead. Every scrape of metal against soil sent a shiver down his spine. The night stretched on, heavy and suffocating, each passing second dragging him deeper into the unknown. Then, a dull thud. The casket. Andrew's body locked up as the men worked quickly, removing the remaining dirt and unsealing the lid. His breath hitched, nausea rolling through him. His hands trembled at his sides as the final latch was undone. The casket creaked open. Andrew stepped forward, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. His eyes fell on the remains inside, and his breath left him in a ragged exhale. It wasn't Emily. The skeletal remains inside were all wrong. The height, the structure, the delicate frame. It was someone else. His stomach twisted. His head spun. His wife had never been buried here. His entire reality had just shattered. Reynolds let out a slow breath. Jesus! One of the men adjusted his gloves, examining the remains. This isn't who you thought it was. Andrew's knees felt weak. Then who is it? The man hesitated before answering. From the bone structure, she was younger. Andrew's blood ran cold. How much younger? The man adjusted his flashlight. Late teens, maybe early 20s. A sharp, sickening nausea gripped him. A girl, who had died in place of his wife. Andrew staggered back, his breath uneven. What the hell is going on? Reynolds' expression was grave. Someone faked Emily's death, and they used this girl's body to do it. Andrew shook his head. Why? Why go through all this trouble? Reynolds exhaled. That's the question, isn't it? Andrew felt like he was unraveling. Everything he had ever known, his marriage, his grief, his past, was collapsing in on itself. Emily had disappeared. Someone had made sure he believed she was dead. And now, a girl he had never met had been buried in her place. His hands trembled. There was only one person who could have answers. Richard Calloway. Andrew turned to Reynolds, his voice raw. We're done here. Reynolds hesitated. Carter. I'm done waiting, Andrew snapped. I'm done being 2 steps behind. He knows what happened, and I'm going to make him tell me. Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's go. The Calloway estate was dark when they arrived, the iron gate still towering and imposing. But Andrew wasn't in the mood to wait for an invitation. He slammed his fist against the intercom. Open the gate, Richard. Silence. Then a crackle of static. A voice. Smooth. Calm. Andrew. I was wondering when you'd return. Andrew's grip on the intercom tightened. Let me in. A pause. Then a soft chuckle. I was expecting you much sooner, to be honest. The gate buzzed, unlocking. Andrew exchanged a glance with Reynolds before stepping inside. Calloway was waiting in the foyer, dressed in another impeccable suit, a drink in his hand, his expression unreadable. Quite the dramatic entrance, he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. To what do I owe the pleasure? Andrew clenched his fists. Cut the act. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Oh, Andrew's voice was ice. We exhumed the grave. For the first time, Calloway's expression flickered. It was brief, so brief that if Andrew hadn't been looking, he would have missed it. The old man sighed, setting his drink down. Ah, so you've finally caught up. Andrew's pulse pounded. Who was she? Calloway studied him for a long moment before answering. Someone unfortunate. Andrew's hands shook. You used her to fake Emily's death. Calloway's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I did what needed to be done. Andrew's chest tightened. Where is she? Calloway exhaled, almost bored. Andrew, you ask the wrong questions. Andrew's entire body tensed. Then what's the right one? Calloway's eyes gleamed. Why? Silence. Andrew's breath hitched. Calloway's voice softened, almost amused. Why would a woman abandon her husband? Why would she disappear so completely? Why would she go through so much trouble to stay gone? Andrew's hands curled into fists. Because she was afraid of you. Calloway's smile widened. Was she? Something inside Andrew twisted. A cold, suffocating realization. Calloway wasn't the one Emily had been running from. Andrew's breath came fast and shallow. It had never been Calloway. It had been him. The room seemed to tilt. Calloway chuckled softly, watching as the truth took hold. Ah, he murmured. There it is. Andrew's stomach lurched. No. Calloway raised his glass in a mock toast. Welcome to the truth, Andrew. Andrew stumbled back, his mind spiraling. Everything. The letter. The warning. The fear. Emily hadn't been afraid of Calloway. She had been afraid of Andrew. And now, after 22 years, he was finally about to remember why. The words echoed in Andrew's mind, reverberating through every corner of his consciousness like a cruel, inescapable riddle. Welcome to the truth, Andrew. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath shallow as he stared at Richard Calloway, the man who had manipulated and tormented him for years. But for the first time, Calloway wasn't the threat. The real threat had been lurking beneath the surface all along, hidden in the gaps of Andrew's memory, in the fragments of his past that refused to fit together. Emily hadn't been afraid of Calloway. She had been afraid of him. The thought was so foreign, so completely impossible that his body rejected it outright. He shook his head violently, his hands trembling at his sides. You're lying, he forced out, his voice cracking. You've been trying to manipulate me this whole time. Calloway chuckled softly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as if this were nothing more than an amusing conversation. Oh, Andrew, do you really think I went through all this trouble just to break your spirit? He tilted his head, eyes glinting. The truth has been inside you all along. I merely nudged you toward it. Andrew's stomach churned, his mind racing to make sense of the implications. No, it couldn't be true. His hands curled into fists, nails digging into his palms. If this is some kind of twisted game, I swear. Let's not pretend, Calloway interrupted smoothly. You've already started to remember, haven't you? Andrew swallowed hard. His mind had been unraveling piece by piece since the moment Sophia and Julia had reappeared in his life. The letter, the exhumation, the flickers of memories he couldn't quite place. A cold sweat broke out along his spine. Calloway took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down with a quiet clink. You see, Andrew, the reason you never found Emily is because you were never supposed to. Andrew's breath hitched. Calloway leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Because 22 years ago, you let her go. A sharp, piercing pain shot through Andrew's skull. He stumbled back, gasping as flashes of memories surged forward. Memories he didn't recognize, yet felt like they belonged to him. The world tilted, the room spinning, and suddenly, he was there, a darkened house, the scent of smoke curling through the air, the sharp crackle of burning wood. And then Emily, her face pale, streaked with tears, her hands shaking. She was standing in front of him, her breath ragged. "Andrew, please." His own voice low, unsteady. "You don't understand." Emily's eyes widened with fear. "I do. That's the problem." A searing pain in his chest. He staggered forward, his vision blurring. "I would never hurt you." Tears spilled down Emily's face. "But you already have." Flashes of movement. Julia's tiny voice, calling out from another room. A door slamming. A suitcase by the door. Emily clutching something in her hand. A letter. The same letter Julia had found 22 years later. Her voice broke. "I can't stay." Panic. Desperation. His own voice again. "Please, Emily. I don't know what's happening to me." Emily's lips parted, her breath hitching. "That's why I have to go." A final flash of heat. A fire. Then darkness. Andrew gasped as he snapped back to the present. His entire body trembling, drenched in cold sweat. He nearly collapsed, his hands gripping the armrest of a nearby chair to steady himself. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp the flood of memories that had just resurfaced. Calloway watched him with quiet amusement. "Ah, there it is." Andrew sucked in a shaky breath, his vision blurring. "No," his voice was barely a whisper. Calloway exhaled as if mildly disappointed. "You always were the last to figure things out." Andrew's head pounded, the fragments of his past slowly piecing together. The fire, the fear in Emily's eyes, the way she had looked at him. Not with hatred, not with anger, but with something far worse. With pity. Reynolds' voice broke through the haze. "Carter, what the hell is going on?" Andrew swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind still racing. He turned back to Calloway, his voice uneven. "What did I do?" Calloway smiled slightly. "Not much." He paused. "And yet, everything." Andrew felt his heart lurch painfully. He didn't need Calloway to spell it out. He could feel it now. Deep in his bones, in the memories that had been buried so long they had almost turned to dust. He had let Emily go. She had wanted to leave, and somewhere along the way he had let himself forget. His body trembled as he forced himself to look up at Calloway. "Where is she?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Calloway tilted his head. "I suppose that depends." Andrew's hands clenched. "On what?" Calloway studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, with an almost lazy motion, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out an envelope. He held it up between two fingers, as if it were insignificant. Andrew's heart pounded. "This arrived 2 days ago," Calloway said. "Addressed to me." Andrew's breath hitched. "From who?" Calloway's lips curved slightly. "Why don't you see for yourself?" Andrew didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, snatching the envelope from Calloway's hand. His fingers trembled as he tore it open, unfolding the single piece of paper inside. His eyes scanned the words. "Andrew, I'm sorry. It was never supposed to come to this. You were never supposed to remember. But if you're reading this, it means you have. And it means I was wrong. You won't stop. You never could. That's why I'm done running. You know where to find me. Emily." Andrew's entire body went numb. His heart pounded. She was alive. She had always been alive. His breath left him in a sharp exhale as he read the final words at the bottom of the letter. An address. Andrew's fingers tightened around the paper. His head snapped up to Calloway. "Where is this?" he demanded. Calloway exhaled, shaking his head as if in mild amusement. Still so predictable. Andrew didn't care. She was out there. She was waiting for him. And this time he was going to find her. No more lies. No more running. Only the truth. At long last,